Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Everyone in Port Charles had been bracing themselves for the moment when the reading of Monica Quartermain's will would finally take place, but no one could have anticipated just how shocking her final wishes would turn out to be. The Quartermain mansion, which had hosted countless family squabbles, fights over money, and power struggles that stretched back decades, was unusually quiet on the day of the reading. The matriarch of one of the most influential families in town had lived through so much turmoil, loss, and scandal, and for years her will had been the subject of whispers. Monica had made changes over time, some rumored, some denied, but few expected the revelations that were about to turn the entire family upside down. As her lawyer entered the room, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before erupting into chaos. Ned sat stiffly in one corner, his arms folded, his jaw set in that familiar Quartermain way that suggested he was ready for yet another round of battle over family money. Beside him, Brooke Lynn shifted in her seat, visibly nervous. Though she had always been proud to be a Quartermain, she knew that legacies in this family came with strings attached. Michael was there too, representing not just himself but the ever-expanding Corinthos connection to the Quartermain dynasty. Even though he had one foot firmly planted in the world of Sonny and Carly, Monica had always insisted that he remain part of her family, and everyone wondered just how much of her estate she would entrust to him. Olivia sat close to Ned, quietly holding his hand, hoping to keep him calm when tempers flared. Drew stood near the back, watching carefully, knowing that his relationship with Monica had been one of deep respect and quiet loyalty. And then there was Tracy, who returned from her latest globe-trotting adventure to make sure she wasn't cut out of what she undoubtedly viewed as her rightful share. With Tracy back in town, everyone expected fireworks. The lawyer began to read, his voice formal and deliberate, as if he understood the gravity of what these words meant to the people in front of him. At first, the instructions were simple, heartfelt words about family, mentions of love, grief, and the enduring ties that Monica hoped would survive long after her passing. Everyone nodded solemnly, touched by the sincerity of her opening remarks. But then came the shock. Monica had decided not to leave the majority of the Quartermain fortune or even the mansion itself to the family members who assumed they would inherit it. Instead, she directed that the estate be divided in ways that no one had foreseen, ways that challenged old grudges, tested loyalties, and raised suspicions about her motivations. Gasps filled the room when it was revealed that a significant portion of Monica's assets had been left to Drew. For years, Drew had struggled with his place in Port Charles, especially since he was Jason's twin and had carried the weight of both acceptance and rejection from the family. Monica had always seen him as her son, despite the complicated circumstances of his arrival. Her decision to leave him such a substantial inheritance made it clear that she wanted to secure his future and cement his place within the family she had fought so hard to hold together. Drew's eyes widened in surprise, clearly touched, but the looks he received from certain family members, most notably Tracy, were filled with barely concealed fury. The next bombshell came when Monica left part of the mansion itself to Michael. Not the money, not the company shares, but a claim to the family home. The Quartermain mansion had always been a battleground, a symbol of wealth, legacy, and control. To grant Michael such a right meant that the Corinthos connection was more deeply entwined in the Quartermain legacy than ever before. Ned immediately bristled, his voice rising as he demanded clarification. To him, the idea of Michael, who had been raised in the orbit of Sonny Corinthos, having ownership of the family's most sacred space was unthinkable. But the will was ironclad, and Monica's words left little room for debate. She had made her intentions perfectly clear. Michael was to always have a place in the Quartermain home, and no one could drive him out. Brooke Lynn leaned forward anxiously when her name was mentioned, hoping that her grandmother's faith in her had been enough to earn her a meaningful inheritance. To her surprise and relief, Monica had indeed left her something valuable, but not in the way the younger Quartermains had expected. Instead of handing Brooke Lynn money or property, Monica gave her the responsibility of overseeing a charitable foundation in Monica's name, one that would continue the doctor's lifelong dedication to helping others. It was both an honor and a burden, as it meant Brooke Lynn had to prove she was capable of carrying Monica's vision forward. Though she felt pride swelling in her chest, she could already sense the side eyes from others in the room who wondered whether she was truly up for the task. And then there was Tracy. Many in the room thought Monica might cut her out altogether, given their history of backstabbing and bickering. But Monica, in her ever-practical way, left Tracy a calculated share, enough to acknowledge her place as a Quartermain but not nearly enough to satisfy Tracy's sense of entitlement. The look on Tracy's face was priceless, a mixture of outrage and disbelief, as though she had been robbed in broad daylight. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before she voiced her fury. The most shocking revelation, however, came near the end of the reading. Monica had left a considerable portion of her wealth to someone completely unexpected, Elizabeth Weber. The room went silent as her name was spoken. Elizabeth had been Monica's daughter-in-law once, and through all of Jason's ups and downs, she had remained a fixture in the family's orbit. Still, no one anticipated that Monica would leave her anything substantial. Yet Monica's will made it clear, she wanted Elizabeth to have financial security, not just for herself but for her children, who carried Quartermain blood through Jake. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes, overcome by the gesture. Others, however, were less moved. Tracy muttered under her breath, Michael shot a glance at Ned, and Brooklyn looked like she was trying to process the implications. Clearly, Monica's will had not just stirred emotion, it had drawn new battle lines. By the time the reading concluded, the room was in chaos. Voices overlapped, arguments broke out, and everyone seemed to be talking at once. Ned accused Monica of undermining the family's legacy by putting the mansion in Michael's hands. Tracy threatened to contest the will, claiming Monica must have been manipulated or not in her right mind when she made such decisions. Brooklyn tried to rise above the noise, focusing on her new responsibility, but she couldn't escape the sinking feeling that her family might never forgive her if the foundation became more important than the family business. Drew remained quiet, clearly moved by the trust Monica had placed in him, though he knew it would paint a target on his back. Elizabeth sat silently, overwhelmed by emotions, wondering how she could possibly live up to the faith Monica had shown in her. The air in the reading room of the attorney's office was thick enough to be sliced with a scalpel. It was the kind of heavy, expectant silence that precedes a seismic event, the collective holding of breath before the ground shifts irrevocably beneath one's feet. Around the polished mahogany table sat the figures who had, in one way or another, orbited the life of Monica Quartermain, now departed. They were the family, the friends, the adversaries, and the beneficiaries, or so they had presumed. Each face was a carefully constructed mask of somber grief, but beneath the surface, the familiar currents of Port Charles ambition, entitlement, and old resentment simmered. There was Alan, her ex-husband, his expression a complex tapestry of lingering affection and the weary acceptance of their long, complicated history. Tracy, ever the pragmatist, sat with a poised, almost impatient demeanor, her mind undoubtedly already calculating the division of assets, the stocks, the real estate, the Quartermain legacy that was, by all rights, meant to be kept within the family. Ned, the responsible one, the businessman, looked on with a dignified calm, while Emily, her heart worn openly on her sleeve, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, genuinely mourning the loss of the woman who had been a mother figure to her. And then there was the wider circle, the hospital board members, old colleagues, a few loyal members of the household staff, all present, all waiting for the formal acknowledgement of their place in Monica's final wishes. The attorney, a man named Sterling with a voice that seemed purpose-built for the dissemination of solemn news, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He began with the formalities, the being of sound mind clauses, the revoking of previous wills. The air began to hum with a nervous energy. This was it. The reading of the will. The last act of Monica Quartermain, a woman known for her brilliance, her strength, her fierce love for her family, and her equally fierce temper. Sterling's voice was measured, devoid of any emotion that might betray the contents of the document before him. He started with the smaller, expected bequests. A trust fund for a favorite niece. A generous endowment to the Port Charles Free Clinic. A collection of first-edition medical texts to the hospital's library, to be named in her honor. Each announcement was met with a soft, approving nod. It was all proceeding as anticipated. The landscape of Monica's generosity was being mapped, and it was a familiar, comfortable map. Then, Sterling paused. He took a sip of water, the click of the glass on the table echoing. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group, and for the briefest moment, it seemed to linger on a space in the room where no one of particular significance sat. A faint, almost imperceptible ripple of unease passed through the attendees. Tracy's eyebrow arched a millimeter. Alan leaned forward slightly. "And now," Sterling said, his voice gaining a new, more deliberate weight, "we come to the primary bequests concerning the bulk of the estate, including the controlling shares in ELQ Enterprises, the deeds to the Quartermain Mansion, the private equity portfolio, and the directorship of the Medical Research Foundation." You could have heard a pin drop. This was the heart of the matter. The reason most of them were truly here. The future of the Quartermain Empire was about to be decided. The collective assumption, unspoken but absolute, was that the fortune and the power would be distributed amongst the family. Perhaps Alan would get a larger portion, maybe it would be split evenly between him, Tracy, and Ned, with Emily receiving a sizable trust. The specifics were debated in hushed tones all over Port Charles, but the who was never in question. It was a Quartermain matter. It would stay with the Quartermains. Sterling read the next line. "I, Monica Quartermain, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, in its entirety, including all stocks, bonds, real property, liquid assets, and intellectual property, to..." He paused again, a torturous, theatrical silence that stretched for an eternity. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on him. Every breath was held. Tracy's hand, which had been resting calmly on the table, clenched into a tight fist. "To my son, Jason Morgan." The silence didn't break. It shattered. It was as if the words themselves were physical objects, thrown into the center of the table where they exploded, sending a shockwave through everyone present. For a full 10 seconds, there was no sound at all. No gasp, no cry of outrage, no murmur of confusion. There was only a vacuum of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Faces, previously composed in masks of grief and expectation, went slack with shock. Eyes widened, jaws literally dropped open. It was incomprehensible. It was absurd. It was impossible. Jason Morgan? Jason Morgan? The reaction did not come all at once, but in a staggered, chaotic wave, as each person's brain struggled to process the information and failed. Tracy was the first to find her voice, though it was strangled, barely recognizable. "What?" The word was less a question and more a verbalization of a system crash. "What did you just say?" Alan stared blankly at the attorney, his mind visibly reeling, trying to connect the words to any logical reality. That can't be right," he stammered, his voice thin. "Sterling, you must have misread." "Jason?" Monica would never. Ned, the cool-headed businessman, looked utterly flummoxed. "This is a joke," he stated, though there was no conviction in his tone. "A very poor taste joke. Jason he's dead." The unspoken words hung in the air, the second, even more profound layer of the shock. Jason Morgan was not just an unlikely heir, he was a deceased one. For years, he had been presumed dead, lost at sea. His memory was a ghost that haunted the halls of the Quartermain Mansion and the streets of Port Charles. His son was being raised by others. His life, his very identity, had been a source of endless pain and conflict for Monica. To leave everything to a dead son? It made no sense. It was the act of a madwoman, not the sharp, calculated mind of Monica Quartermain. Emily let out a small, choked sob, this one not of grief for Monica, but of confusion and distress for the brother she had loved and lost. Why, she whispered to no one in particular. Why would she do that? He's gone. He's been gone. The room erupted. "This is an outrage!" Tracy shouted, finding her full voice now, fueled by a fury born of thwarted entitlement. "I demand to see that document. This has to be a forgery. My sister would never be so foolish as to leave the family's legacy, our birthright, to a ghost. It's ludicrous." "There must be a clause," Ned said, his mind racing through legal possibilities, trying to find a foothold in this new, insane reality. "A contingency beneficiary. Something. You can't bequeath an estate of this size to a person who is legally deceased. The probate court would never allow it. The assets they'd be in limbo. It would tie everything up for years. Sterling remained impassive, though a faint sheen of sweat had appeared on his brow. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for it. But no amount of preparation could truly armor one against the raw, emotional tsunami of a Quartermain family scandal. "The will is quite specific," he said, his voice straining to maintain its professional calm. "It names Jason Morgan as the sole beneficiary. There are no contingency beneficiaries listed for the primary estate." "But he's dead," Alan roared, finally pushed past his own shock into a state of angry agitation. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "My son is dead, Sterling. Monica mourned him every day of her life after he was gone. This is an act of grief-stricken insanity. We can contest this. We will contest this." The word contest seemed to ignite a new fire in the room. It was no longer just about shock, it was about war. The reading of the will had instantly transformed from a procedural formality into a declaration of battle. The vast, unimaginable wealth and power of the Quartermain Empire was now hanging in the balance, attached to the name of a dead man, and every person in that room knew that whoever could successfully navigate the legal and emotional minefield that would follow could potentially claim it for themselves. The disbelief began to curdle into something darker, more calculating. Glances were exchanged around the table that were no longer just about shared surprise, but about strategy and alliance. Tracy's eyes narrowed as she looked at Ned. Ned's gaze became guarded as he met Alan's. The family, forever fraught with internal conflict, was now staring into an abyss of total familial warfare. But beneath the immediate legal and financial implications, a more profound, more personal confusion took root. Why? Why would Monica do this? It was a question that echoed in every mind. Was it a final, grand gesture of a mother's undying love for the son she had lost? A symbolic claiming of him as her true heir, beyond the reach of death itself? Or was it something else? Something more complex, more nuanced, and perhaps, more destructive? Monica's relationship with Jason had been one of the most complicated tapestries woven in Port Charles. He was her son, her firstborn, the child she had given up as a baby and who had returned to her life as a dangerous, enigmatic man. She had fought to love him, to accept him, to integrate the man he was with the son she remembered. Their history was a roller coaster of acceptance and rejection, of fierce maternal protection and bitter disappointment. To leave him everything was either the ultimate apology for a lifetime of complications or the ultimate act of posthumous control, tying the living family forever to the ghost of the son she could never fully reclaim. And then, another layer, one that only a few in the room might have considered: what if it wasn't about Jason at all? What if it was a message? A final, magnificent act of manipulation from beyond the grave? By naming Jason, a man who could not claim the inheritance, Monica had effectively thrown a lit match into a room soaked in gasoline. She had guaranteed chaos. She had ensured that the vultures would circle, that the knives would come out, that every secret, every betrayal, every hidden ambition within the family would be dragged into the light of a brutal probate court battle. Was this her way of finally exposing the rotten foundations of the family she both loved and despised? Was it a test? A punishment? The initial stunned silence was now a cacophony of raised voices, accusations, and legal threats. Tracy was on her phone, calling her own lawyer. Alan was pacing, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself about Monica's state of mind. Ned was deep in conversation with Sterling, pointing at clauses in the document, his voice low and intense. Outside the confines of the attorney's office, the news began to leak, as it always did in Port Charles. A whispered phone call from a paralegal, a text message from a stunned family member. The ripple of disbelief spread from that stuffy room out into the world. At the nurses' station on the 4th floor of General Hospital, the heart of Monica's professional domain, the news landed like a bomb. Epiphany Johnson, who had worked alongside Monica for decades, froze with a chart in her hand, her usually impervious expression crumbling into one of pure shock. "She did what?" she breathed, the words barely audible over the hospital din. Around her, doctors and nurses stopped their hurried routines, clustering together, the gossip spreading in hushed, incredulous tones. The hospital itself, a place Monica had helped build and shape, was now part of an estate bequeathed to a ghost. The future of its funding, its research, its very direction, was suddenly thrown into terrifying uncertainty. Down in the locker room, Patrick Drake, once a protege of Monica's, heard the news from a buzzing intern. He sank onto a bench, his mind reeling. He thought of Robin, of the complicated history they all shared with Jason. He thought of the sheer, staggering impossibility of it all. Only in Port Charles, he muttered to the empty room, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. Only Monica. At Kelly's, the rumor was passed over coffee cups by reporters and cops alike. Diane Miller, ever the brilliant attorney, heard it and immediately saw the legal nightmare unfolding, a case that would be talked about for decades. She also saw the opportunity. Over by the counter, Max Scorpio heard the whispers and felt a profound sadness settle over him. He thought of Jason, of the young man he had once tried to guide, of the life cut short, and now of this, his name being used as a catalyst for what promised to be an ugly, drawn-out war. He thought of Robin, away from it all, and was glad she was spared this fresh hell. The shockwaves reached the Metro Court, where Carly Corinthos was in a meeting about expanding her hotel empire. When her phone buzzed with a text from Michael, the color drained from her face. She excused herself, walking on unsteady legs to a quiet corner. Jason. Monica had left everything to Jason. Her Jason. A torrent of emotions flooded her, a fresh wave of grief for the man she had loved so deeply, a blinding fury at Monica for this final, chaotic act, and a cold, sharp fear for what it would mean. Jason's son, her grandson, was a potential heir through his father, but the path to that was a minefield of legal challenges. And Sonny, this would send Sonny into a tailspin. The precarious stability of their world was, once again, shattered. And indeed, at the warehouse that served as the unofficial hub of his organization, Sonny Corinthos received the news from a grim-faced Max. He listened, his expression darkening, the coffee in his hand forgotten. For a long moment, he said nothing. He thought of his best friend, his brother in everything but blood. He thought of the countless times they had stood back to back against the world. And now this. His name, his memory, was being used as a pawn in a game he would have despised. Sonny's jaw tightened. This wouldn't stand. He would not let Jason's memory be dragged through the mud of the Quartermain's greed. He would burn it all down first. The disbelief was universal, but the reactions were as varied as the individuals themselves. For some, it was about money and power. For others, it was about love and legacy. For all, it was about the stunning, incomprehensible final choice of a woman they had all thought they knew. Back in the attorney's office, the initial storm was subsiding into a cold, hard reality. The will was read. The words were spoken. The challenge was issued. The battle lines, though not yet fully drawn, were beginning to appear in the tense silence between family members. Alan finally stopped pacing and looked at Sterling, his voice weary but resolved. What happens now? Sterling let out a long, slow breath. Now, he said, the estate enters probate. Given the unique circumstances of the named beneficiary, I would anticipate a contestation period. There will be hearings. There will be evaluations of Mrs. Quartermain's mental state at the time the will was signed. There will be motions filed. It will be a long process. A public process. The words hung in the air. A long process. A public process. The Quartermain family's darkest secrets, their most bitter rivalries, their most private shames, were all going to be laid bare for the entire city to see. Monica's will was not just a document dispersing wealth, it was a key that was about to unlock every hidden door in the family's mansion. As the attendees began to gather their things, moving like zombies in a state of shock, the true genius, or the true cruelty, of Monica's final act became apparent. She had not provided a clean ending. She had not offered closure. She had, instead, created the perfect beginning for a new, epic drama. She had ensured that her death would not be an end, but a catalyst. She had guaranteed that the name Quartermain and the name Jason Morgan would be on everyone's lips for a very, very long time. The disbelief would linger for days, a pervasive cloud over the city. But soon, it would be replaced by something else, strategy, ambition, greed, and a desperate, fighting love for a man long gone. Monica Quartermaine had left the stage, but with one breathtaking, stunning move, she had ensured that the play was far from over. In fact, the curtains had just been pulled back on the most explosive act yet. And everyone, from the hallowed halls of the Quartermaine mansion to the gritty streets of the waterfront, was now a player in Monica's final, breathtaking production. The game, as they say, was afoot. And no one knew what the rules were, or if there were any rules at all. The room was packed with family, friends, and a few opportunistic hangers-on, all gathered under the pretense of paying their respects to Monica's legacy. Edward Quartermaine's portrait loomed over the proceedings, a silent witness to the chaos his widow's words would unleash. The air was thick with tension as the lawyer, a bespectacled man with a nervous habit of adjusting his tie, cleared his throat and began reading the document. From the first sentence, it was clear that Monica had not left a simple distribution of assets. Instead, she had woven a tapestry of revelations, each clause a carefully placed landmine designed to detonate at the precise moment for maximum impact. The first shock came early. Monica's estate, which included her substantial shares in ELQ, the family's corporate empire, was not to be divided equally among her children, as everyone had assumed. Instead, she bequeathed the lion's share to Jason Morgan, her son who had long distanced himself from the family's machinations. Jason, who sat stoically in the back of the room, his leather jacket a stark contrast to the tailored suits of his siblings, showed no reaction, but the room erupted in gasps. Tracy Quartermaine, her face a mask of indignation, slammed her hand on the table, demanding an explanation. How could Monica favor Jason, who had rejected the Quartermaine name for years, over her other children who had fought tooth and nail to preserve the family's legacy? The lawyer, visibly sweating now, pressed on, revealing that Monica's decision was tied to a letter she had written, to be read aloud only after her passing. In it, Monica explained that Jason's loyalty to his principles, however unconventional, mirrored her own commitment to integrity over ambition. She wrote of her pride in his independence and her belief that he, more than anyone, could steer ELQ away from the greed and infighting that had plagued it for decades. The letter was a gut punch to Tracy, who had always seen herself as the rightful heir to the Quartermaine throne. Her eyes narrowed, and it was clear she was already plotting her next move. But Monica's will wasn't done stirring the pot. The next revelation turned its attention to Ned Ashton, Monica's nephew by marriage but a son in her heart. Ned, who had spent years balancing his loyalty to the family with his own ambitions, was left the Quartermaine mansion itself, a gesture that seemed generous until the fine print was revealed. The mansion came with a condition: Ned was to maintain it as a family home, open to all Quartermaines, including those he had clashed with over the years. This meant Tracy, who had been evicted from the mansion in the past, would have a legal right to return. The room buzzed with murmurs as Ned's jaw tightened. Monica had effectively tethered him to the family's dysfunction, ensuring he could never fully escape the chaos. Then came the bombshell that no one saw coming. Monica had included a provision for Sam McCall, Jason's ex-wife and the mother of his children. Sam, who had been sitting quietly, her expression unreadable, was bequeathed a substantial trust fund for her children, but with a twist: the funds were to be used exclusively for their education and well-being, and Sam was to have no direct access to the money. This clause sparked immediate speculation. Was Monica protecting her grandchildren from Sam's influence, or was this a subtle jab at Sam's past as a con artist? Sam's eyes flickered with a mix of hurt and defiance, but she said nothing, her silence louder than any protest. The will didn't stop there. Monica had left a series of smaller bequests to various individuals outside the immediate family, each one laced with meaning. To Carly Corinthos, her longtime friend and occasional adversary, Monica left a collection of personal letters written over the years, documenting their complicated relationship. Carly, who had slipped into the room late, expecting nothing, was visibly moved, clutching the envelope as if it were a lifeline. To Elizabeth Weber, Monica bequeathed her collection of medical texts, a nod to their shared history as nurses and a subtle encouragement for Elizabeth to return to her roots in medicine. Each gift was a reflection of Monica's keen understanding of the people in her life, and each one carried a message that lingered long after the reading.